Play the Polish, side 1. The opening we are going to examine is the Polish defense to the queen's pawn, a logical but neglected system. White begins by playing 1 pawn to d4, and black answers pawn to b5. This move strikes at a central square c4, thus preventing white from playing his regular move pawn to c4. Black's bishop is also able to come to the b7 square, where it commands the whole of the central long diagonal. In his turn, white is able to play his pawn from e2 to e4, but this is sometimes something that black may even welcome, because then his bishop will have a target to hit against. The opening is aggressive expansionist. White's space advantage in the center is partially balanced by black's on the queen's wing. Let's make another point. Black's bishop at b7 controls the white squares. So too does his pawn at b5. In that sense, they harmonize together. Without the pawn at b5, there's a danger that white will be able to blot out the black bishop by moves such as pawn c4 and pawn to d5, as occurs frequently in the Queen's Indian defense, which is the other defense where black fianchettos his queen's bishop. By preventing white pawn to c4, the pawn at b5 also aids in the battle for control of the d5 square, a square which black may one day occupy with his king's knight, should white ever advance his king's pawn to e5. Naturally, the pawn at b5, being so far advanced, may prove a target, but often it can be used as a diversionary target, a decoy, while black cleans up in the center. A word about transpositions. The Polish defense may transpose into the St. George opening, which begins pawn to e4, pawn a6 by black, white pawn d4, and black pawn to b5, or possibly white pawn e4, e6, pawn d4, a6, b5. Well, the purpose of this tape is to underline the advantages of the Polish defense, in that black is able to play his pawn straight away to b5, and then his bishop to b7 on move 2. That means he doesn't have to play pawn to a6. So, black's central counterplay begins very early, and in many cases he's able to dispense with the move pawn to a6 altogether, as white simply does not have the time to capture the pawn. This extra tempo in the opening can be an important trump in the hands of a well-primed black player. We shall begin our survey by showing a couple of illustrative games to give you a feel for the defense. Later we'll come to a more precise theoretical examination. Now, in this game, white begins pawn d4, pawn b5, pawn e4, bishop b7, white bishop to d3, black pawn e6, white knight comes to f3, black pawn a6, white pawn c3, black knight f6, white queen e2, black pawn to c5, and we reach a fairly typical situation for the defense. Now, as you can see, white has been able to set up an almost perfect pawn center, but black has pressure against it. His knight and bishop are trained on the e-pawn, his c-pawn attacks white's d-pawn, and in certain cases the pressure against the d-pawn may be reinforced by a black knight coming to c6 and a black queen to b6. Notice another feature of the position. White is not able to drive black's knight on f6 any further back with his center pawns at the moment. If, for example, he plays pawn to d5 here, black will exchange pawns, play queen to e7 and then pick up white's d-pawn. Now on the other hand, if white plays his pawn up to e5, then the black knight on f6 goes to d5, and the presence of the black pawn at b5 prevents white from driving this d5 knight further back by the move pawn to c4. Now notice also the position of the kings. White will castle early and comfortably on the king's side, but because of white's threat to play pawn to e5, which will drive the black knight away from f6, black will not be in a hurry himself to castle. If he does, he may run into a rapid KO attack by bishop takes h7 check and knight to g5 check in many circumstances. So black has to be careful to keep an eye out for that possibility. Well, black therefore will keep his king in the center. In some cases he may castle kingside, or he may even go to the queen's side. Now that's enough of general ideas. Let's continue with the game. To alleviate the pressure on e4, white brought his bishop from c1 to g5. And black immediately asked the bishop by pawn to h6. White played bishop takes f6, black queen takes f6. Well, this exchange of pieces, it's not clear exactly who it favours. In some ways black, because he's gained the two bishops. In others white, because the queen on f6 is not that well placed. Now, white now played his knight from b1 to d2. And black at this point played a very provocative move. He brought his knight from b8 to c6. This intensifies the pressure against the d-pawn. White now advanced his pawn up to d5, which certainly looks a very strong move, because if black takes the pawn, white will take discovered check, and after black moves his knight to e7, white could move his knight in to e4, and it looks like curtains, of course. So after pawn to d5, black doesn't castle. He plays his knight to e5, white plays knight takes knight, and black plays queen takes knight. From this sort of play it becomes apparent that black must conduct himself against white's central pawns in a certain fashion. He should think of himself rather as a matador, teasing the little white bulls to advance, but he must always remember their capacity to gore him to death should he make a false step. Now in this position, white captured on e6, pawn takes on e6, and this in fact sets a subtle trap, or perhaps unsubtle trap. How would you recapture in this position? Well, if black automatically plays d takes e6, which in most circumstances would be a very good move, white can shock him with bishop takes b5 check, and after pawn takes b5, queen takes b5 check, forking the king and the bishop. On the other hand, if black takes back with the f pawn instead of the d pawn, the g6 pawn square looks a trifle weak. So in the circumstances, black recaptured with the queen, which has got something to be said for it, because the queen takes itself away from what might be an exposed square. So you'll see white's knight may come to f3 at some point, and also the e-file is opened for pressure against the white e-pawn. Let's continue with this game now. White castled kingside. Possibly it would have been better to play pawn to c4, because here black played his pawn up to c4, driving the bishop back. White moved bishop c2. Black played his bishop out smartly to c5, which incidentally pins the white f-pawn. So white moved king to h1 here. Black castled kingside. White played pawn to f4. And black moved pawn to f5. With this move, black thematically puts pressure on the central white square at e4. He also takes advantage of the pin on the e-pawn, because of course e takes f5 would lose the white queen. So white broke the pin here by playing his queen out to h5. Meanwhile setting off a pin of his own, because black cannot take on e4 now because his bishop at c5 is hanging. While answering pin with pin, black swung his queen over to c6. This time it's the long diagonal leading to g2 which is in question. White can't capture on f5 because of mate to his king. Thus, to break the pin and to continue with his attack, white moved his rook from f1 to f3. Black plays rook from a8 to e8, planning now to invade on e2 should white capture at f5. Instead, white moves rook to g3, and this has the strong threat of rook to g6. This is a flash point for black. He needs to find a good reply. Perhaps you would like to turn off your tapes and find one for him. Well, the move played was queen to d6, hitting the knight at d2 and also the pawn at f4. So white now threw everything into the offense with knight to f3. Black played pawn takes e4 and white knight into e5. Another critical moment. Black can't play rook takes f4 here, because white would then capture his rook at e8. So instead black moves his rook up to e6, and white plays what he thinks is the killer move. Rook from a1 to d1. Well, what do you think of this move? Have you got an answer? Well, to this move black had prepared the stunning rook takes f4, so that if white captures the black queen, he's mated on the back rank. That really is the end of the game, except it still has to be won, and the following moves ensued. White played his knight to g6, black moved down to f2. White knight came in to h4. Of course, black cannot capture the bishop at c2 because the queen goes, and there wouldn't be any mate after that. So black chooses a different move, queen to f8. This incidentally meets the threat of knight f5. And also there's a threat of rook f1, which is going to be mate. White replied to this by moving his rook to g1, but this was not a great help. Black just played rook to f1, and now white had no choice but to give his queen up by queen takes c5. Black queen takes c5, white rook takes f1. Well, white is now a queen down. He's got a rook and a knight for it, and possibly a little bit of an attack. So if you're not very good at winning one positions, try to find black's subsequent moves. Black played here queen to h5, hitting the knight at h4. White moved his knight into f5 and hoping now to do something against g7. But here black played sharply rook f6, and after rook takes g7 check, king h8, the white knight is helplessly pinned at f5. White played here pawn to g4, black pawn went to e3, discovering check, white king to g1, and black queen came into h3. And at this point white resigned, because the long diagonal threat of mate at g2 is decisive. The second sample game I'd like to discuss is the Karpov-Miles encounter of early 1980. Though this also began with the move pawn to e4, the positional ideas running through the game are very relevant to the Polish defence. Now this game began pawn to e4, black pawn to a6, white pawn d4, black pawn to b5. Karpov now blinks, but otherwise showed no reaction. White here moved knight to f3, black's bishop went to b7, white played bishop d3, knight to f6, queen e2, pawn came to e6, and now white played pawn to a4. This thrust is highly significant, so I want you to take time out and study the position by switching off the tape. With the move pawn to a4, white is not only trying to disrupt black's pawns on the queen side, he's also challenging black's control of the white squares. It takes little imagination to see that if b5 falls, white may well be able to play pawn to c4. And then the threat of pawn to e5 is that much stronger because black's knight at f6 has no square at d5 to jump to. Faced with a move like pawn to a4, black should first look to see whether he can counterattack against white's centre, particularly the e4 square. Secondly, he should look at playing pawn to b4, which locks up the position but may have positional drawbacks in some directions. Finally, black should consider capturing on a4. This seems to leave him with an irretrievably weak queen's rook pawn, the one on a6. But things are not as bad as they look, as this is only a side pawn, and black can often counterbalance its weakness by play in the centre. For example, well, a very crude example, if white got enough pressure against the a6 pawn and played something like bishop takes a6, he'd have to think first about what he's going to do about his e-pawn, because this is attacked by the black pieces. Now, in the actual game, Miles chose the first alternative, which was one of counterattack. He moved his pawn from c7 to c5. You may like to analyse this position and decide what compensation he would obtain had Karpov decided to accept his pawn sacrifice, because it is in fact a pawn sacrifice. Afterwards, you'll find some analysis of the position in the booklet. Now, Karpov's answer to pawn c5 was to capture pawn takes on c5, thus lending the game the air of an open Sicilian. However, after this move, black gets a comfortable game, so white should have kept the tension by playing pawn c3. After white's pawn takes c5, black played bishop takes c5, white knight to d2, black pawn to b4. White pawn came to e5, black knight to d5, the white knight came into e4 attacking the bishop at c5, so this retreated to e7. White castled kingside, black queen came to c7, white bishop moved to d2, and now black knight to c6. Now please turn off the tape once more and study this position. This is another fairly typical position. Notice how the knights at e4 and d5 balance each other out. How black's pawn at b4 performs a useful service in restraining the white queenside pawns, particularly the one on c2. There's another feature of the position, which is the weakness of white's pawn at e5. Unfortunately, that white knight, so beautifully placed on e4, does block off the defenders along the e-file to the pawn, and in fact black is threatening to capture the pawn at e5. Rather than retreat his knight at e4, Karpov resorts to violence. He plays pawn to c4, pawn takes c3 en passant. White knight takes c3. Here black played knight takes c3. White bishop takes c3. Black knight moved into b4. Now again here it's interesting to note that the pawn exchanges on the queen side have enabled black to find favourable squares for his pieces on that wing. In this case his knight has been enabled to come to b4. So nothing ventured, nothing gained. Had black simply kept his pawns at home on the queen side, he would have just been swamped on that wing. But the expansionist play, which he has followed, has ensured that he obtained key squares for his pieces. Now the game here continued with white playing bishop takes b4, black bishop takes b4, white rook from a1 to c1, black queen b6, white bishop to e4. Now at this point, Miles considered the material had been sufficiently reduced to permit himself to castle, which he did. He castled kingside. However, I would like you to consider what would be the result had white played bishop takes h7 here. This is the famous Greek gift sacrifice. Could Karpov have got a good game by this method? Well, after you've done your analysis, turn to the booklet for a full discussion of the position. We'll pass on, and I'll just mention that this is an example of white's attacking chances against the black king, and shows that black must always be careful about castling short. Of course, the bishop takes h7 sacrifice appears here because black's bishop at the moment is on b4. If it had been back on e7, of course, then the sacrifice doesn't work because the white knight can't get to g5. Now, in the game, Karpov thought that bishop takes h7 check was rather speculative, so he didn't play it, and instead he moved his knight to g5. Black played pawn h6, bishop to h7 check, king h8, bishop back to b1. Now this plan is that if black plays pawn takes knight, white plays queen to h5. Well, black didn't fall for that. He played his bishop back to e7. White moved his knight to e4. Black played his rook from a8 to c8. And the position here seems to be tending in black's favour. He's got two strong bishops, and the white pawns at e5, b2 and a4 are looking much weaker than black's pawns. In fact, Karpov here fell to bits by playing queen to d3, hoping for some discovered attacks against the black king. But he'd overlooked Miles's riposte. Rook takes c1, white rook takes c1, and black queen takes b2. Attacking the rook, which moved to e1, and now came queen takes e5. And black won a pawn and later the game fairly easily. Well, the dismal jimmies of the chess world have said that Karpov was just ill or off form during this game, but at the same time, one doesn't beat a world champion every day, and we must also remember that Karpov is usually a killer with white pieces. So I leave you to draw your own conclusions from this game. Now, next part of the tape, I want to look at the early moves of the defence in more detail. We're going to start pawn d4. Black plays pawn to b5. First, we should look at the less aggressive moves for white. One of them might be to play a quiet queen's pawn opening, hoping to exploit black's queen's side weaknesses later. Let's try pawn to e3, black bishop to b7, white knight goes to f3. White hasn't put a pawn at e4 and now threatens to capture the b5 pawn. So black plays pawn a6, and white, to disrupt black's game, plays pawn to a4, black pawn to b4, white pawn to c4. This little interchange has allowed white to get 2 pawns abreast in the centre. For if black now captures en passant, white will be able to recapture with his b pawn, and anyway bring his pawn up to c4 later. Black doesn't want this to happen. Particularly, he doesn't want white to have an open b file as well, because he has got a bishop on b7, and bishops are vulnerable to attacks along files because they move along diagonals. So black would rather have this file closed up and let white have a pawn at c4. Now, 2 pawns abreast in the centre is not too bad. 3 pawns is what black doesn't want to permit. So black must keep a watchful eye on e4 to make sure white doesn't play e4 too easily. Let's see how black continues. He plays knight to f6, striking against e4. White bishop comes to d3, black pawn to e6, white castles. Now black begins his plan, pawn to d6. White from b1 moves his knight to d2. Now this is a critical moment. White's ready for pawn to e4 followed by pawn to d5. So black counters now with pawn to c5. His plan is to answer pawn takes d4 if white should play pawn to e4, and then when white recaptures with knight takes d4, black can now move his knight say to d7, and he's got squares at e5 and c5 available for his pieces. Well, this position actually arose in a game Balshan Basman, Ramat Hasharon, Noan Sofa Memorial Tournament 1979. It's about equal, I should say. Now let's turn to another possible formation for white. Now this one's going to be similar to the last example. White's going to play quietly in the centre, but first he's going to develop his bishop outside the pawn chain. In fact, he's going to play what's called a London system against the Polish. So this is the sort of game you're going to get against Michael Franklin, I expect. Now white will play pawn to d4, and black plays pawn to b5. Now pawn to c3 is possible. This was played in the game Goodman against Basman. Black plays pawn to e6, white knight f3, black bishop to b7. White struck with pawn to a4, and black pushed on pawn to b4. Now white brought his bishop out to f4. Well, black has been delaying deliberately the development of his knight to kb3 because he doesn't really want it to be pinned by white moving bishop to g5. After all, his knight on f6 will be attacking an important square, that is the e4 square, so he doesn't want it to be nullified. Now, after white has moved his bishop to f4, black does bring his knight out to f6. White plays pawn to e3, and now comes black pawn to h6. Well, black's got several plans in this position. He could clearly just play something like bishop e7 and castle kingside, but he's aiming for something more aggressive. After all, white has played a very passive formation. White senses danger here and plays pawn to h3. Black played pawn to a5. White bishop comes out to d3. Now black hits out with pawn to g5. White bishop to h2. Black rook to g8. This expansion on the king's wing looks a bit peculiar, but it is thematic because black's fianchettoed his bishop, and therefore the advance on the king's side should increase the scope of the bishop. And of course, white's not going to be able to castle kingside very comfortably in this position. Usually, of course, black doesn't get the time or the space to carry out maneuvers like this, but he's taken advantage of white's bishop, the bishop coming out to kb4, to make this expansion possible. Now the game continued, knight from b1 to d2. Black played his pawn to h5. This is of course why he played his rook to g8. He can't move his pawn to h5 until the g-pawn is defended, so now the pawn comes up to h5. White plays pawn e4 and black pawn c5. I'd like to speak a bit about the positional implications of this setup. The black king has, he's got to remain in the centre. He won't be able to castle either wing because black's been sending up all his pawns on both sides of the board. But he has got a nice little cosy hole behind the pawns at f2, f7, e6 and d7. Now, not only has black given up the right to castle, he has also given up another right which is quite highly regarded. This is the right to connect rooks, which usually goes with the possibility of castling. However, this idea of connecting rooks needs to be examined more carefully. You don't have to connect bishops, you don't have to connect knights, so why does one have to connect rooks? Sometimes it's more useful to have one rook active on the king's side and one rook active on the queen's side, as in this case. Well, standard development ideas indicate that one should clear the first rank of minor pieces and the queen and the king in order that the rooks can move freely along the baseline. But it seems to me to base one's whole development plans upon this idea, it makes it a bit restrictive. Not having this idea means that one could be more leisurely in developing pieces. For example, black's bishop on f8 has got quite adequate possibilities where it is, and there's no rush to bring it off the back rank. Now after that positional digression, we shall plough on with the game. White's last move, pawn to e4, is a good one because it hampers the line of the bishop at b7. Both sides have now completed their preliminary mobilization, and the fighting becomes hand to hand. White played here pawn from c3 takes on b4. Black could of course recaptured, but instead he chose to play his pawn up to g4. White now moved his knight into e5, which actually is quite a good move, certainly better than capturing on g4. Black now played pawn takes on d4 and white pawn takes on a5. Now turn off your tapes here and analyze the position. What do you think black should play? Now in this position, which is diagram 1, black can choose to play queen takes a5, which looks a natural move. At the time I was thinking that white might play his knight from e5 to c4, black plays queen to b4, and white could play pawn to a5, with the threat of rook to a4. Still, this is probably not as dangerous as it looks. So if black plays pawn takes h3 and white plays rook a4, black could still go queen to c5, white knight to b3, and black's queen could then move over to g5. Lines like this show the agility of a queen, which can be attacked by minor pieces, but often the net result is only the dislocation of the minor pieces themselves, rather than the discomfiture of the queen. Now back to diagram 1, and black didn't capture on a5, he played knight to c6, which wasn't quite as good, because here white could have played pawn to a6, and if black plays bishop takes a6, white plays knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, bishop takes a6, rook takes a6. In this position, black's pawns are actually rather disrupted, and it may be this position is better for white. Anyway, white missed this opportunity, and he played pawn takes on g4 instead. This was something of an error, because now black was able to recapture this pawn with his knight, and he was able now to put a lot of pressure upon white's g-pawn. The continuation was white takes knight on c6 with his knight, black plays bishop takes c6, and now white moved his bishop up to f4. Black moved bishop to b4, putting a pin on the knight at d2. White played king f1. Now, have a look at this position. Decide how you will continue as black. Surprisingly enough, white loses a piece here. Black just moves queen to f6. White's bishop at f4 cannot retreat to g3 because of black playing knight to e3 check. So white must play queen to f3. Now at first I was thinking of all sorts of complicated ideas like rook takes a5, white knight c4, and then rook to f5. But then I realized that rook takes a5 was completely pointless, and if black just plays pawn to e5 instead, which I did play, black just wins a piece, because the knight at d2 is hanging. White, to his horror, now found that he was losing a piece and made the best of a bad job. He played rook takes on h5. Black played pawn takes f4. White played knight to c4. Black's king went to f8. And white played queen to h3. Now, white's beginning to get a few threats here. Nothing definite, but on the other hand, it's not easy for black to find a clear continuation. He played his queen from f6 to g6, and white played rook to f5, which of course he was threatening anyway. Now have a look at this position and see how you'd continue as black. Rather than meekly surrender the f-pawn, black jettisons it with pawn to f3. Well, despite several ways of capturing this pawn, none are really satisfactory. For a start, if white plays queen takes f3, black will win his queen by knight to h2 check. Now, pawn takes f3 is another disaster after black plays knight to e3 check, because clearly if pawn takes knight, then queen comes down to g1 check, and well, if knight takes knight, well, it looks like queen to g1 check. Well, maybe not that immediately. Black had better play pawn takes knight back first. Well, knight e3 check looks rather good. So from this position, which is diagram 2, after pawn to f3, white in fact played rook takes on f3, which is not much better, because now black can play bishop takes e4, white bishop takes e4, black queen takes e4. White played queen to h5. There's a clear threat of mate in 1. Black queen came back to e6. And now in extreme time trouble, white played pawn to g3 and resigned after queen takes c4 check. But he was anyway a piece down, and now he's 2 pieces down. Play the Polish side 2. Now let's return to move 1, and we'll look at a direct but misguided attempt to exploit the black pawns on the queen side. Playing pawn to d4, pawn to b5, white pawn to c3, black pawn to e6, white queen to b3. Now when white plays an early pawn to c3, it might be a signal that he's going to bring his queen out in this way. He could of course continue in the fashion of the previous game, but there's always a chance that, as I said, this queen comes to b3. Now the idea of this move is to take advantage of black's early pawn advances on the queen side. And in fact it's quite a popular maneuver, due to a, I would say, incorrect article published by Tim Harding about 8 years ago, which had quite a lot of influence. It was published in Chess. And so several opponents have played this against me, which nearly always results in me getting a clear advantage. Now, The move order I have chosen as black, that is putting the pawn on e6 and the pawn on b5, was designed to combat this possibility of bringing the queen out to b3. I think it's quite possible to develop black's bishop to b7 anyway. It's just that it's even stronger to delay it until you're sure where the white queen's going to go. If you remember earlier, I did mention that bishops can be vulnerable to attacks on files and ranks because they are diagonal pieces, and the queen on b3 will aim at the black bishop when it gets to b7, except of course there's a pawn in the way, the pawn at b5. But white's hoping that black will put his bishop on b7, and then white will be able to play pawn to a4 and try to get something against the pin on the bishop at b7. Well, this maneuver, even under very favourable circumstances, doesn't work very well, and under these circumstances of the present position on the board, it works even less. What the upshot is that white sometimes wins a pawn, but his queen just loses so much time that black gets a very easy game. Let's see what black plays. First he guards his pawn by pawn to a6. White plays knight to f3, and black plays knight to f6. Now white plays pawn to a4, trying to break up the black pawns on the queen side. At this point, black has an interesting tactical move. He can play pawn to b4, which at first sight seems to lose a pawn, because white could now capture pawn takes b4. And now black plays his knight to c6. This attacks white's pawn at b4. Of course, if white had not brought his knight out to f3 a couple of moves ago, the knight to c6 move would also attack the white pawn at d4, which is why I helped white by putting this knight on f3, to give him this line in more favourable circumstances. Now, what does white do in this position? If he plays his bishop to d2, then black can bring his knight to d5, once again putting pressure on that pawn. So instead, white plays his pawn down to b5. Now black plays pawn takes on b5. Well, it's clear here that pawn takes pawn loses a rook, which is the whole point, and white really has to take with the queen. And now black's pieces become active. He brings his bishop out to a6. White's queen doesn't have many squares, probably goes back to b3. And here, if black plays moves like rook to b8 and knight to b4, he has got lots of activity for the pawn. He might even play knight to a5 into b3, I suppose. But anyway, there's a lot of scope for black in that position. Another fairly common line for white is to exchange his centre pawn for black's side pawn. Now, from the start position, white plays d4, black b5, white pawn to e4, black bishop to b7. Now, instead of guarding the central pawn by some means, white plays bishop takes b5, and black captures bishop takes e4. White knight comes to f3, black knight f6, white castles, black pawn e6. Now really, black's position in the centre here is too solid and unblemished for white to succeed. White does get a very active position, and he's able to put his rook on the central file. But on the other hand, black has got his advantages too. He's managed to get rid of white's central e-pawn, and that means white won't be able to play pawn to e5, and that means white's kingside attack lacks in strength. For a start, black is able to keep his knight on f6. I expect the best move for white would not be, say, knight c3, but to play something like pawn c4 in order to enable white to push down later with pawn d5. But even so, black's e6 square is well supported. Now, in these circumstances, probably white's best chance is to go for a queenside advance, advancing all his pawns down on the queen side. But on the other hand, I still feel black has got an equal position. You'll probably find a game between, I think, Yellen and me and Piggott and me with these lines. Now let's look at the main line positions. Play again one pawn to b4, pawn to b5, white pawn to e4, and black bishop to b7. Now look at this position. White has several ways to guard his pawn, and we have to decide which is the best. Well, we can discount possibly queen moves, though even queen to e2 for white isn't totally absurd, because white can later play his bishop into a fianchetto. We can also look at pawn to d5 at some point, though not at the moment. Now let's see what other ways white has of guarding the pawn. He can play his knight out to c3, which is going to lose the pawn after pawn b4, knight d5, pawn e6. He can also bring the knight to d2, we'll be looking at that. He can bring his bishop to d3. He can play pawn to f3. And possibly he can play pawn to e5. That's another idea which I believe Chandler has been using with success against Hodgson. Now let's look first at what will be the more common moves to meet. First, I'll have a look at pawn to f3. And this looks a very sensible way for black to defend the e-pawn, because it blocks the diagonal of black's bishop. On the other hand, it is a little passive. Might be okay for black to play such a move if he was trying to hold white back, but it's ill-suited for the possessor of the initiative. It's also rather inharmonious. White's natural formation is to bring his knight to f3, but now it must come out to less powerful squares, say on e2 or h3. Now a third point is that white, in shoring up his position on the white squares, is in danger of becoming weak on the black squares, particularly the diagonal a7 to g1, which is always a rather tender diagonal for white, and also the diagonal from h2 to b8. We'll see an example of this shortly. Now, after white plays pawn to f3, black's got to defend his pawn, I suppose. Pawn to a6. And white plays bishop to e3. Logical. Pawn to e6. And now maybe bishop to d3. Now, white's placing his bishop on e3 is very consistent with his intention of preventing black from playing pawn to c5. However, black doesn't have to carry on passively with pawn to d6 here. He could do pawn to d6, knight d7 and c5, but there's also a possibility of him playing pawn to c5, which I think is quite interesting. Now, if white captures pawn takes c5, I suppose he'd better. Black plays queen c7, trying to regain his pawn. Now white will probably try and hold the pawn by pawn to b4, otherwise he hasn't got anything. And let's see what black can do in this position. I think he has two possibilities of attacking white's pawn chain. Certainly black shouldn't really leave the pawns there because they are cramping him and preventing, say, the development of his king's bishop. Now let's look first at pawn to d6. This looks promising if white captures pawn takes d6, black plays bishop takes d6. And here the bishop is hitting in two directions, at the pawn at b4 and the pawn at h2. And this line is an example of white's weakness along the black squares. Now after pawn to d6, it's possible for white not to capture on d6. He could play his bishop out to f4, from e3 to f4, pinning the pawn at d6. This is quite clever, and I suppose rather annoying as well. What should black do against this? Well, we can try pawn to e5. White's bishop goes back to... no, white's bishop doesn't go back yet. He plays pawn takes d6 first. Then black plays bishop takes d6, and white goes bishop back to d2. Now this is similar to the last position, except that the diagonal of black's bishop on d6 has been blocked. On the other hand, black seems to have quite a good game because white isn't able to play pawn to c4, and that means black's got pressure along the c file. He can probably develop by moves like, well, knight f6 and castle, and also play knight d7, and then this knight may come into b6 and to c4. As well as that, his rooks look as though they're going to get some play along the central files as well. And it's true also that white has his bishop on d2 has vacated the diagonal at e3, so black may be able to play queen b6 at some point as well. Well, this is black's long-term plan, positional compensation for the pawn. And I suppose we should look at whether white can disrupt this idea suddenly. Say black plays here knight f6, white plays pawn to a4, trying to liquidate all the pawns on the queen side and then be able to advance with pawn c4. But as white hasn't developed on the king side yet, he may be biting off more than he can chew. So let's imagine black castling here, white capturing on b5, black recapture, white takes on a8, and black recaptures with the bishop. Now maybe bishop takes b5. Here black seems to have some compensation. He can play rook to d8. Maybe now the bishop goes back to d3. Now let's try knight to c6. That's not a bad idea, because if white plays pawn c3, black can play bishop takes b4 and pick up the bishop at d3. And if white doesn't do that, well, it looks like black's going to be able to get the pawn back on b4. I suppose white could play pawn to b5, but then his pawns get a bit disjointed. Maybe black will go knight to b4 here. Now returning to the position of diagram 3, black has another idea to gain counterplay besides pawn to d6, and that is to play pawn to a5. Now this idea is to disrupt white's pawns before he can solidify them with moves like pawn a3 and pawn c3, which will be ideas similar to the queen's gambit. Here if white, say, captures the pawn at b5 with his bishop, black will take on b4, and then the c5 pawn will be going. And the same if white captures on a5, he can't hope for any advantage. His pawns are much too split. So usually white will play something like pawn to c3. And here black can try an interesting idea. He can play the move pawn takes b4, white pawn takes b4, and now queen to e5. This has a direct threat of winning the rook at a1, so white plays knight to d2, and now black can move his queen into c3. Queen is a very powerful piece. It can strike in several directions at once. I think it can strike in 8 at once, which does make it very strong. And here it's attacking the pawn at b4 and the white bishop at d3. It's interesting that white doesn't seem to have a good defense in this position. If he, say, moves his queen to b1, now if black plays knight c6, white can play knight e2. So better than knight c6 looks to be rook to a3, exploiting the sort of pin along the third rank. Turning now to the position of diagram 4, this is after white's played bishop e3 and black pawn e6. Now instead of bishop d3, white could try to play knight to d2, which has the idea of answering pawn c5 by pawn takes c5, queen c7, then knight to b3, when black will get less attacking chances than in the last line, because white's queenside pawns will not be so badly placed. Now in answer to knight d2, again black could play quietly with perhaps pawn to d6, though you might have to watch out for knight to b3 to a5, which could be slightly annoying, not tremendously. Now here black can answer pawn to f5, as white hasn't played bishop d3, and if white plays pawn takes f5, black pawn takes f5, and now if white plays bishop to d3 here, this could be met either by pawn to g6, or more actively black might play queen h4 check, then if bishop f2, queen to g5, which attacks the pawn at g2 and also defends the pawn at f5. So this is a possibility for black after knight to d2. Now let's look again at the start position after pawn d4, pawn b5, pawn e4, bishop to b7. Now white can also guard his pawn here by playing bishop to d3. Now, this leads to an interesting conjecture. Should black play a standard formation with knight f6, e6 and c5, and a6 of course, as we've seen from the example in side 1, or should he try to take advantage of white's last move by playing pawn to f5 here, since the white pawn at e4 is in fact pinned? Now, for reasons which are analysed in the booklet, the move pawn to f5 doesn't appear to be good, as the attack which white obtains after pawn takes f5, black bishop takes g2, and then white queen to h5 check is too strong. Now it's possible to attempt to strengthen black's game by playing after bishop to d3 not pawn to f5 but first pawn to c5. As white has played his bishop to d3, black is trying to dispense with the move pawn to a6 and start his counterattack more quickly than before. Now black's idea is this: if white captures on c5, he'll play pawn to e6, as in earlier examples. On the other hand, if white plays pawn to c3, black can play pawn takes d4, white pawn takes d4, and now pawn to f5. And the position here is different to the last one. White can, it is true, sacrifice a rook by pawn takes f5, bishop takes g2, and then queen to h5 check, pawn to g6. But now, as black will have a check at a5 at some point in the subsequent variations, this could make all the difference between white having a mating attack and black's king escaping via d8. Now you might like to consider the variation here. White plays pawn takes g6, black bishop to g7, white pawn takes h7 check, black king to f8. Now in this position white can capture on g8 check the knight, though after black recaptures with the king, in fact white has to lose a bit of time with his queen. And a stronger idea is to play knight to f3, which I think would be decisive if black didn't have this check on a5 at some point. Now let's see how black continues against knight f3. He can play knight to f6, white goes queen to g6, and now black plays bishop takes h1. These takes the rook. Now if we look at this position, if white immediately comes in, say with knight to g5 or knight to e5, black has got king to e8. So first white tries bishop to h6, and here black can play, well, he can play a couple of moves, I should think. He can either play rook takes h7, knight g5, and then queen to a5 check, or he can play queen to a5 check straight away, and then if white moves his king, say to f1, black can play bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop check, and now king to e8. And this check on a5 has been useful because in other situations white would be able to play his bishop down to g6 and it would in fact be mate, but here the black king can go to d8. Well, the position isn't 100% clear here, but still black does seem to be material up, so we'll leave that with the supposition that black will get adequate play. Now I had a game with this series of moves, well, not exactly, but first lot anyway, against Pigott. Now please return to diagram 5, and when I played pawn to c5 and white played pawn c3, white here played, black here played pawn to, black here took on d4 first, yes, c takes d4, c takes d4, and now pawn to f5, and white didn't take up the challenge of sacrificing a rook. He played his knight to d2. Black played knight f6, white played pawn to f3, black played knight c6, attacking the d pawn, and white played knight to e2. Now here I played my queen to b6, but after white captured on f5, as it turned out, I didn't get such a good game, and it seems better might have been for me to have captured on e4 straight away. Pawn takes e4, white knight takes e4, now possibly pawn to e6, and well, let's say if white goes bishop g5, bishop e7 seems to be okay. If white captures bishop takes f6, black can recapture with the g pawn. So here, if white now castles, maybe black plays queen to b6, and he can possibly follow up by knight to b4 and bring a knight to d5. This looks like quite a good position for black. Now we'll leave the bishop to d3 move with the remark that it probably isn't the most accurate because black gets all this counterplay along the diagonal. And we'll come to the position after pawn to d4, pawn to b5, pawn to e4, black bishop to b7, and white's third move, knight to d2. This is the most insidious move of them all. White blocks his queen's bishop, and this knight doesn't look to be well placed on d2, but it's defending the f pawn and also, sorry, the e pawn, and also black can't play pawn to f5 now because there isn't any g pawn to capture at g2. And thirdly, of course, white's threatening to play bishop takes b5. Now, in a game against Chandler, I waited for white to do this move and then played pawn to e6. That went something like pawn to a6, white pawn to a4, and now pawn to e6. And white captured on b5 a couple of times, at which point I played pawn to f5, and in fact obtained quite good counterplay, and even a winning position, but later lost it. You can find that game in the booklet. Now, I'm not going to go into this game because it was analysed on the St. George cassette, and also I should point out that white could decline the gambit by playing knight to f3, leaving black with a positional problem of what to do with his b pawn. Now, we're going to turn our attention to this problem here. After the white knight comes to d2 and black plays pawn a6, and white now plays pawn to a4, challenging the pawns. Of course, he can play more quietly other lines, but this is the most critical. So white plays his pawn to a4. Now, if black now responds with pawn to b4, white is going to play his pawn up to c4. Now, you remember a very early example on side 1 of this tape, the game Basman, where white succeeded in playing this advance. And I remarked, or I didn't, but I might have remarked, that 2 was company and 3 is a crowd. Now, in the earlier game, white's pawn had only got to e3, so the advanced pawn to c4 was not to be feared. But here white is all ready to suppress the black bishop at b7 by playing pawn to d5. Therefore, it looks like black will have to play pawn takes pawn en passant here. But after white recaptures pawn takes pawn, he's all ready to use the open file, the open b file, for his rook and queen, and this embarrasses the black bishop at b7. So maybe something better should be found for black after white's pawn to a4, and probably in this position black's best would be to capture by playing pawn takes a4, which would be better than pawn to b4. In the first place, the b file will remain closed and just be the a file which will be open, and in the second, white will have to waste a bit of time recapturing that pawn on a4. Thirdly, if white plays his pawn up to c4, then black will have squares along the b file, possibly at b4, to put pieces on. Now, a possible continuation might be, after a4, pawn takes a4. Well, white will probably not play pawn to c4 immediately, because black might get a blockade on the black squares by pawn e5. Then if white captures, well, black should be able to regain that pawn. Or if he plays pawn to d5, black could play bishop to b4, followed by queen to e7, a5 and knight a6. As I said, blockading on the black squares. So instead of immediate pawn c4, probably knight f3, then black can play pawn e6. And now he's threatening pawn c5, so white plays at this point pawn to c4. Well, I expect black could play quietly here with bishop b4 followed by knight e7 and castling, and then maybe d6, knight d7, pawn to a5, or maybe pawn to f5. That is bringing his bishop out, then bringing his knight to e7 rather than f6, where it hasn't got a secure position. Though even this is worth considering if black is able to play pawn to d6 in some circumstances. Obviously not with the black bishop on b4. Anyway, besides that continuation, it should be possible for black to play something like pawn to g5 here, and white's knight will be in bit of difficulty on f3. We'll assume white plays pawn to h3 here. That isn't vitally necessary, but may well be the best move. Then black could go bishop g7, white bishop d3, black pawn to h5, and if, say, white here goes pawn to e5 with the idea of bringing his knight to e4, or his bishop to e4, then black could play pawn to g4, and after the capture of pawns and the capture of rooks, white's knight still hasn't got a good square to go to. It'd have to go back to g1, but then black could play queen h4. So this is a possible line which maybe needs testing, for black to play actively against white's immediate attempt to play pawn a4 and pawn c4. Now let's have a look at lines after knight d2 where black endeavours to dispense with pawn to a6 altogether. This would be the more Polish aspect of the opening rather than the St. George aspect. Now we begin with pawn d4, pawn to b5, pawn to e4, bishop b7, knight d2. Now here, instead of playing pawn a6, we can try knight to f6. Now this is in appearance a gambit because white can play pawn to e5. Then black could try knight to e4, but after knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, pawn to f3, bishop goes back, say, to g6. White can probably take the b pawn with impunity. So black plays knight to d5. Now white plays bishop takes b5. If he does anything else, black will play a6 and his knight is secure on d5. Now at this point black moves his knight into f4, aiming for counterplay against white's g-pawn. If you'd like, turn off your tapes here and see what you think of this position. It's an interesting one to analyze. Well, I should say white will play knight to f3 here from g1. Black plays knight takes g2 check, white king to f1. Now black might as well go the whole hog with knight to h4. White knight takes on h4. Black bishop takes h1. And now we have a fearsome move from white, pawn to e6. Well, this is looks terrifying because black can't capture either way. One it's pinned, the other way is mate. Well, or near as no matter, mate. So, what should black do here? I suppose he might as well try pawn to c6. White pawn takes f7 check. Black king takes f7. White queen to h5 check. Black king to g8. Now in this position black's king has been buffeted around, but I don't see a mate for white, and black is the exchange ahead. Of course, if bishop c4 check, then pawn to d5 has to be played by black, and it's anyone's game. It's not clear that white has got compensation for the exchange here. There may be a danger here that black will get his bishop trapped by pawn f3 followed by king to g1. So possibly in the position after black king g8, white bishop c4 check, maybe pawn to e6. Now if pawn f3, which is necessary, otherwise black plays bishop d5. After pawn f3, possibly pawn to d5 by black. Bishop back to b3. Maybe it can go to d3 as well. Bishop to d3. Now possibly bishop e7. Now at this point, white's knight on h4 is in as much trouble as black's bishop on h1. So both sides may lose their errant pieces. Now if this line holds for black, it means he can continue his attack against white's e-pawn without playing the move pawn to a6. Let's see how far he can get. So after knight f6, we'll say therefore that white plays bishop to d3, which looks a good idea because black can't now play pawn to f5. At this point, black has to decide whether to play pawn c5 or pawn to e6. There is a difference here because if black plays pawn c5 and white plays pawn c3, black can capture on d4 and white must recapture with his c-pawn because he can't capture with his knight from f3 because he hasn't got there yet. On the other hand, if black plays pawn e6 and then pawn c5, white will have got his knight to f3 and will be able to recapture on d4 with the knight, in which case black would have to play pawn to a6 and then knight to c6. Now, if black plays pawn c5, white can also capture d takes c5, and then the variation after pawn to e6, pawn to b4, pawn to a5, pawn to c3, knight to c6, queen b3, knight g4, knight f3, queen f6. That's fairly unclear. On the other hand, black could play after white's pawn takes c5, knight to a6, and this may enable him to get his pawn back anyway. Anyway, we'll play black pawn to e6, white knight to f3, black pawn c5, white pawn c3, and now black pawn takes on d4. Now white, if he captures with the knight, black will have to play a6 and then play knight to c6, which looks okay for him. On the other hand, if white recaptures with the c-pawn, then black must play queen to b6, which guards his b-pawn. He's trying to do without the a6 move. White castles kingside and black plays knight to c6, which reaches the position of diagram 6. Now I suggest you turn off the tape and study this position for a while. Black is threatening to capture white's d-pawn, and white has to decide how best he should defend his center. Well, it's not easy for white to actually defend his center and keep his bishop at the same time. For example, if he plays knight to b3, then there is the move knight to b4, and the e-pawn is attacked, and also white's bishop at d3. Well, from the position of diagram 6, white can possibly decide to sacrifice his d-pawn to open up the e-file by playing d5 immediately, but probably this isn't the best way to sacrifice it, because after black captures the d-pawn, his knight may come round to c7 and then to e6 and thus block up the e-file. Probably most dynamic for white is to play knight to b3, and then if black plays knight to b4, which seems the next logical move, white can then play pawn to d5. Now the point of this whole move is for white to bring his bishop to e3, thus gaining tempi against the black queen on b6, and thus hopefully exposing the premature development of the black game. Well, it is a pawn sacrifice. Black can play knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and now it is possible for black to take the pawn by pawn takes d5, and then after e takes d5, black can either recapture with the bishop, or he can recapture with the knight. Now if he recaptures with the bishop, white would be able to play something like bishop e3, black queen b7, and now not knight a5 because of just queen c7, but knight c5, and here probably black has to go queen to b8, and then say rook e1, black bishop to e6. And white's certainly pushing black to the wall, but he may not be able to demonstrate the crusher. I think this light position might be playable for black. Of course, black could also capture with the knight, and this would prevent white's bishop from going to e3, but I think this is probably even worse than taking with the bishop, because say if black captures with the knight and white plays check, rook e1, then bishop e7, then white could go bishop e3. If black takes, knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, black is in some difficulty down the central e-file. Now it's possible the capture of the pawn may not prove viable for black, and therefore from the position of diagram 6 after white knight b3, black knight b4, white d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d3, sorry, queen takes d3, it's possible also for black to decline the sacrifice and play simply pawn to b4, and this, but then white might be able to play bishop e3, black bishop a6, white queen c2. From diagram 6, black may also have moves instead of knight b4, such as bishop e7, and if white bishop e3, knight g4, bishop f4, pawn to a5, h3, knight f6, bishop e3, possibly pawn to d5. Or he may play pawn to a5 straight away, and if bishop to e3, knight g4. White, after pawn to a5 from diagram 6, might play pawn to d5, and if pawn takes pawn, bishop e3. So it remains to be seen whether this position from the Polish defence has anything to offer above the normal St. George positions with pawn to a6.